Time is up. Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for St Albert, Edmonton.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I rise to speak on Bill C-33, legislation that amends several acts and pertains to Canada's ports and railways. This legislation was initiated following reviews by this government beginning in 2017 and 2018 respecting railways and ports, as well as the issuance of a final report of the government's National Task Force on Supply Chains. It is no secret that we have serious supply chain issues in Canada, supply chain issues that have been exacerbated under these Liberals. After 8 years of these Liberals, is it any surprise that our supply chains have worsened? Of course not, because after 8 years of this completely incompetent Liberal government, everything in Canada is broken. Housing is no longer affordable. We have seen 40-year high inflation, an unprecedented spike in violent crime, and a supply chain crisis. That's what you get after 8 years of these Liberals, a total and utter disaster for Canada. And consistent with that, Madam Speaker, what we have from these incompetent Liberals is this bill, which they have touted as the solution to modernizing Canada's transportation systems and strengthening Canada's supply chains. The best that can be said of this bill is that it is a missed opportunity. Don't take my word for it. Take the words of key stakeholders. For example, CP Rail characterized Bill C-33 as a whole bunch of nothing. What a ringing endorsement from one of our largest national rail lines. A whole bunch of nothing in the face of what the government's own task force on supply chains characterized as a breaking point when it comes to the transportation supply chain system in Canada. And as bad as a whole bunch of nothing is, Bill C-33 is likely worse than a whole bunch of nothing because, in fact, this bill will likely exacerbate supply chain backlogs as a result of more red tape, more fees, and more government. That is the position of the Chamber of Shipping as well as the Association of Canadian Ports. Indeed, the Canadian Association of Ports said, in respect of Bill C-33, that what we don't need is more government. But that is precisely what we get with Bill C-33, more government in the way of more red tape, additional regulatory burdens, and duplicative reporting requirements for our ports. Last March, when the then Minister of Transport, the member for Mississauga Centre, spoke to this bill at second reading, he claimed that this bill would reduce cost pressures, thereby making life a little more affordable for everyday Canadians. Madam Speaker, how can the member for Mississauga Centre, the then minister, the failed minister, now former minister, square that assertion with the reality that is Bill C-33, which is more red tape, more regulatory burdens, and more reporting requirements, the combination of which is going to increase costs that will be passed down to everyday Canadians. New costs in the face of a cost of living crisis manufactured as a result of the disastrous policies of this government, from out of control inflationary deficit spending to carbon tax 1 and carbon tax 2 that are increasing the cost of everything, including essentials, and now this. And Madam Speaker, for a bill, a key objective of which is purportedly to address supply chain challenges, more can be said about what is not in this bill than what is in this bill. There is nothing in this bill that provides for railway service reliability. There is nothing to address long-standing challenges between our railways and shippers. There is nothing in this bill that provides that port authorities ought to make decisions based upon what is in the national economic interests and in the best interests of supply chains. There is nothing in this bill that addresses issues around labor disputes and the impact that such disputes may have upon supply chains. Last summer, in July, we saw the very significant costs of labor disruption when we saw a weeks-long strike, a strike that went on for weeks at federally regulated BC ports. It was a strike that was completely unavoidable. It was a strike that was entirely foreseeable, having regard for a simmering labor dispute months before. Where were these incompetent Liberals? They were asleep at the switch until it was too late. And there was a significant cost in terms of major disruptions to workers and businesses. Each day that the strike lasted, there was nearly $1 billion in trade that was tied up and impacted, and it cost the Canadian economy $500 billion, a $500 billion hit to our economy, not to mention the damage that it did to Canada's reputation as a reliable trading partner. Madam Speaker, that is what you get with these incompetent Liberals. And this bill, predictably, has nothing to address situations like that. And it's not just the strike that happened last summer. We've seen other strikes, we've seen other blockades, and we've seen inaction and indifference from these Liberals. And while the bill does nothing to address supply chain issues, despite the rhetoric of the government, what it does do is it provides for more Ottawa in the way of centralized decision-making. It would add to Port Authority boards representatives from government entities, diluting representation from port tenants. What that means is that suppliers, shippers who know best about supply chain challenges will have diluted control, all the while increasing control for Liberal-appointed Ottawa know-nothing bureaucrats. And then there are advisory boards that this bill provides for that are poorly defined in terms of their powers, that could have the impact of actually impeding decisions of port authorities to grow, expand, and modernize. Exactly the opposite of what is needed to address real supply chain issues. And then we have the minister appointing chairs of port authorities, as the minister said, to align port authorities with decisions of this Liberal government instead of what their mandate ought to be, which is to advance the national economic interests of Canada. Madam Speaker, this is a badly thought-out bill, a badly drafted bill. The Liberals ignored much of the feedback that they received during the consultation process. The appropriate thing for them to do is to scrap this bill, go back to the drawing board, and get it right. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Laurentides.
The honourable member for Laurentides-Labelle. This is my first time speaking in this session. I hope it's a good one. I'd like to congratulate my colleague. I have a lot of respect for him. I have a basic question. This is a bill that people will say there's not enough substance to it, that it doesn't go far enough. But given our experience at committee, did I hear my colleagues say that there was stuff in this that could be dealt with at committee? So setting aside the intent, particularly when it comes to safety, because we never want to go through what we already went through in Quebec, does he agree with me that this bill is worth giving a chance to send it to committee and then later we can reject it?
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my friend from Laurentides LaBelle, who I have a lot of respect for as well and have enjoyed working with her closely on the Procedure and House Affairs Committee. Let me say, Madam Speaker, that rail safety is of utmost importance. I agree with the honourable member. One of the shortcomings of this bill is that it doesn't go far enough to enhance rail safety. The Transport Committee had a report, a rail safety report, that has been sitting on the shelf for several years. It contains a number of good recommendations. None of those recommendations have been incorporated into the bill. But the problem with this bill is there are too many problems with the bill. And if it were a matter of fixing a few things here and there with some amendments, then we could support it going to committee. But the problem is that there are too many issues on particularly the Port Authority side, and it is on that basis that we cannot support the bill. It is on that basis that we are calling on the government to go back to the drawing board.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, my question to my colleague, and thank you for his speech today. My question to my colleague is, Laurie Desrochers and Pamela Fraser are two people whose family members perished in separate instances as workers for CN Rail. These deaths were not investigated by an impartial government or police investigation, but were investigated by CN Rail's own private rail police and corporate risk management. And since then, unfortunately, the families have received no justice, and CN Rail has faced no consequences. And my question to the member is, does he believe that railway corporations should be able to avoid being held accountable for the death and injury of their workers by investigating themselves?
The honourable member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank the member for Nanaimo Ladysmith for that question. And let me express my condolences to the families. I am not familiar with the facts of each of these incidents, but rail safety must come first, and we need to have in place appropriate legislation and an appropriate regulatory regime to ensure accountability across the board and to ensure that the safety of rail workers comes first.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. L'honorable député de Berthier-Masquinongé.
The honourable member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. I am pretty much where my other colleague was on this. We're here to study legislation. Obviously, there are defects. One of the defects was doing nothing for a big, long time and then suddenly saying, oh, we have to hurry up, folks, and rush this through. A bit like what we saw with Lac Mégantic. My colleague mentioned this earlier. There are expropriations and tracks being mapped out before Transport Canada has even given the green light. So there are certainly questions about the way this government handles the legislative agenda, and they need some guidance. But I would invite colleagues to perhaps sit down at committee and do the work that needs to be done, because this is very important, and what the committee can do is also very important. When I think of the people of Lac Mégantic, well, we have a duty to work for them. So I'd like to hear if my colleague has anything to say about that.
Well, Madam Speaker, I appreciate the member for Berthier-Masquinongé speaking about addressing some of the problems and failures that resulted in the tragedy at Lac Mégantic, and there is no one who has been a stronger champion for addressing rail safety measures arising from the issues from Lac-Mégantic than my colleague, the member for Mégantic-Lorab. But, Madam Speaker, this bill is fundamentally flawed. It's a bad Liberal bill, and we're not in the business in the official opposition of supporting bad legislation coming from this government propped up by the NDP. I'm certainly not prepared to support a bill that key stakeholders such as the Chamber of Shipping and Association of Canadian Ports have made clear is actually going to make the supply chain crisis worse, not better.
Resuming debate.